President Trump insisted during Tuesday's debate that a coronavirus vaccine was coming soon. One day later, biotech company Moderna revealed it won't have anything for distribution until spring of 2021. However, drug maker Pfizer says it is further along. The company has set an ambitious goal of 100 million doses by the end of the year. However, lawmakers are raising concerns. Some say that the process is being politicized by the White House and that an announcement ahead of Election Day could be used to try and sway voters. ProPublica dug into how to tell a political stunt from a real vaccine. Caroline Chen is one of the co-authors of that article. She covers healthcare for ProPublica, and she's done extensive reporting on the coronavirus. Caroline, thanks for joining us. The FDA requires certain protocols from companies before a vaccine can be produced and distributed to the public. Tell all of our viewers, what are those protocols?
Sure. So starting with the phase 3 trial, first of all, we don't yet know what is going on in these trials. So this is the part where science just has to do its thing. So the first thing that needs to happen is that the trial has to reach the point where you can show that the vaccine is significantly more beneficial than the placebo arm. So nobody can predict when that's going to happen right now. Pfizer doesn't know this because Pfizer is blinded to the trial. So there's only a very small group that actually knows who has gotten what in the trial, and that's to preserve the integrity of the trial. So you can guess, based on infection rates, how soon that will be reached, but nobody knows the exact date. That depends on how quickly people are getting sick in the trial. So once that's been reached, then Pfizer or whoever is first, it looks like it'll be Pfizer right now, can submit an application to the FDA. And then the FDA reviews that application, looks at all the data, and then decides whether or not the vaccine is ready to go to market. And the FDA has to think, not only does it actually work, but also, is this actually a safe vaccine? And so it has to consider both those elements because this is a vaccine that's going to be going into the arms of a lot of healthy people. So that's a pretty high bar.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You wrote and you mentioned just now about Pfizer's trial being the furthest along. Is it possible that the drug maker will meet the requirements set by the FDA in the next month, that these processes that you were just describing might be reached before Election Day?
Yeah, so as I said, nobody knows right now because you cannot tell how quickly the trial is going to reach that moment of statistical significance. So truly, if anybody says, I know exactly the date that there's going to be data, they can't. Nobody has this crystal ball right now. And in fact, it is going to be pretty hard for Pfizer to have a vaccine that is released on the market by Election Day. It is possible that they'll have data that is available, and Pfizer told us that they anticipate that the trial could have data as early as the end of October. But then, as I mentioned, the FDA still has to then review the data and come to its own decision. And the FDA has also promised that it'll bring the data before an advisory committee. And this is the panel of outside experts, totally independent, not part of the FDA, that reviews the data and gives the FDA their own recommendation. And this is a really important process so that there is outside independent experts. So all of that is going to take a little bit of time. But it's really important that this all gets done for the sake of making sure that we have a safe and effective vaccine. And so when you add all of that together, the experts that we talked to said that it's quite unlikely at this point that we'll actually have a vaccine that's on the market available by Election Day, even if Pfizer has data before Election Day.
In a memo to employees, the CEO of Pfizer called this week's presidential debate disappointing and said political rhetoric surrounding vaccine development is, quote, undercutting public confidence. We're also seeing skepticism increase in polling. What type of safeguards beyond the one that you just mentioned are in place so that a vaccine isn't rushed to market due to political pressure? And given that there is this independent council that's going to be evaluating it, should Americans feel confident at this point that any vaccine that is approved for usage will in fact be safe and not political?
Yes, so absolutely. I think it's so important that the FDA be allowed to do its job as a regulator, that it has ample time to review the data, and then that there is a transparent process, which involves, of course, as we mentioned, the advisory committee, but then also the FDA being able to share its clinical review documents with the world. So it explains its rationale for why it decides to authorize the vaccine when it comes out, and also for Pfizer to publicly share its data so that everyone can review that. So these will all be important steps that need to happen. And ultimately, the reason why this is so important is that not only does the vaccine need to be safe and effective, but people need to actually take it for us to be able to have an effect against this pandemic. So it needs to be a trusted vaccine. And so for all these reasons, we can't rush. And yes, this process cannot be politicized.
Yeah, it's so important that we get the vaccine right. Ultimately, do you think that political pressure could still impact the nation's vaccine standards, even given all the safeguards that the FDA insists that they are putting into place? And as a follow-up to that, how would the American public know if it has been rushed?
Yeah, so one thing that I'm definitely going to be looking out for is to make sure that the man who is charged with making the decision here, Dr. Peter Marks, he's the head of the Center for Biologics at the FDA. He said that he would resign if he felt that a vaccine got rubber stamped that was not safe and effective. Now, technically speaking, Dr. Marks could make a decision and his boss, the commissioner of the FDA, could overrule him. And in fact, technically speaking, HHS's head, Dr. Azar, could overrule Dr. Han. So I think this is something we'd be looking out for. If there are conflicts in the process where someone says, you know, I don't want it to be approved, and then someone overrules that person, you know, ideally we'd see a full alignment where the advisory committee says we want to recommend this, we think this is good, and Dr. Mark says he thinks this is good, and there's no conflict in the process at all, that everything lines up. The data is fully transparently published so everyone can see the data, and the FDA documents are also fully transparently shared with the public so we can understand their rationale. And that then, very importantly, this then means that physicians can explain the data to the public so they understand what they're getting. How effective is this vaccine? Exactly. Are there any side effects that we should be looking out for? So this full transparency really needs to flow from the company to the FDA, to physicians, to patients, so that we all can understand what we're getting.
All right, Caroline Chen, thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.